This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host, researcher and entrepreneur, Olli Tikkanen.
Welcome everyone. I'm very excited about today's guest. He's professor of physical activity, lifestyle and population health at the University of Sydney. He's the Charles Perkins Centre team leader on physical activity, exercise and energy expenditure. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to welcome our guest, Professor Emmanuel Stamatakis. Welcome, Emmanuel.
Hello, Olli. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for finding the time to be guest in this podcast. So to start off with, you have done research widely related to physical activity and sedentary behavior. What is the things that you get most excited about at the moment?
Yeah, it's true. I have a fairly broad portfolio in terms of research activity over the last 10 years or so. And I still, as my professorial title implies, I'm still quite broad. My main passion, my main interest, and my background are on physical activity, and that's where my disciplinary home is. However, I do have a broader interest on lifestyle in the broader sense. The couple of projects I would say that I'm most passionate about, and these are project streams, programs, little programs that are at different stages of maturity, is the dog ownership and human health, which has been running for some 3 or 4 years. Unfortunately, we had to scale it down a little in the last year or so due to funding circumstances, but it's still alive and kicking overall, and will continue. The second area that I am investing quite a bit of energy in the last couple of years is the Prospective Physical Activity Sitting and Sleep Consortium. This is a very long-term research enterprise, very collaborative. Obviously, as a consortium, it will involve a large number of parties. I've been hugely enjoying it. And finally, the third area that I would like to mention as one of the most exciting for me is the high-intensity incidental physical activity. It's a concept that we coined the term, but I'm very well aware that others have discussed the same concept, high-intensity incidental physical activity, in the sense of those very brief bouts of high-intensity physical activity that are embedded into daily living, that they're not exercise. And I believe that it's a very exciting concept, and we do plan. We have a fairly sizable program ahead. I think it's very exciting because it has been researched very, very little. And public health standards, in particular the American, the US physical activity guidelines, by formally and explicitly removing the 10-minute bout requirement, open new opportunities, new avenues for capitalizing, for making use of this very brief, higher intensity physical activity bouts.
Yeah. And actually, like you said, you are using the word incidental. Could you explain or tell the definition of incidental physical activity?
Sure. That's a very good question. And I should mention that since we coined the term and we've started using it in our interactions with the media, with funders, obviously we have a few grant applications under review at the moment. We put in a number of applications this year. I had thought that incidental is a term that everyone would recognize and would instantly understand what it is, but I don't think that that's the case. I think we were wrong. So incidental basically is all that incidental physical activity is all those activities that are done as part of our normal living. In other words, walking to work is incidental physical activity. You walk to go from point A to B. It's not done specifically as exercise. It doesn't take preparation. Incidental physical activity is carrying shopping back home from the supermarket, walking to the bus stop, walking up the stairs at work instead of using the elevator. So incidental means that it's part of daily living. It's not planned and structured. And just for clarification, I should mention that, yes, some aspects of even the examples I mentioned, they may involve a bit of planning. Like, for example, walking or cycling to work. You have to take the decision. So it's a conscious decision. You take the cycle to work. You may need to prepare you to pack up your backpack. But the overarching principle is that it's the physical activity that we do that usually replaces car trips or other types of transportation. But also incidental, the value of incidental physical activity in relation to the concept of HIIPA, high intensity incidental physical activity, is that intensity is something that we can modulate. The person, the individual can modulate intensity in their everyday life. And this is a concept that neither physiologically nor behaviorally researchers have looked into closely. And that's what we're planning to do.
And now, as you told, the definition of incidental physical activity, do you see there a big difference between the term non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or is it quite the same?
Yeah, there have been quite a few other terms that broadly describe the same concept. One of them is NEAT. You've mentioned James's Levin work about 20 years ago. Another one is Martin Gibala's from McMaster University in Canada, exercise snacks. That's a term that was introduced a few years ago, and there have been a few proof of concept trials. They all essentially describe the same concept. And I did mention earlier that I have started thinking about it twice. I have started reconsidering perhaps the term we initially introduced, because I think our utmost priority, if we are to develop this concept and do research and get the public to engage, understand its value, and try to do more of it, is to come up with a term that is very easy to remember. So all these terms, essentially they describe the same thing. Obviously, exercise snacks has a connotation of exercise, so it implies higher intensity, and it is about higher intensity. Martin Gibala's work, Martin Gibala, for those listeners who are not familiar, he has coined the term sprint interval training. Essentially, all these terms describe the same thing, but exercise snacks and high intensity incidental physical activity have an extra element in relation to NEAT, and that element is higher intensity. Exercise snacks, for example, refers to very high intensity and very brief bouts. Stair climbing is the modality of incidental physical activity that Martin Gibala's group have tested. And our HIIPA is explicitly about also about high intensity physical activity. So yeah, the three terms describe the same thing, but the most recent terms, our terms and exercise snacks, has also the additional element of high intensity physical activity. And I think it is worth considering this extra dimension of incidental physical activity, because we know that higher intensity physical activity, although as sporting and exercise activity, it is there are many serious barriers to doing it. No one has looked at its incidental, its everyday, day-to-day living aspect, which overcomes many of those barriers, the barriers to doing exercise, in particular the time barrier, which is the number one reason why people say, physically inactive people say that they don't exercise. The first reason in pretty much all surveys I've seen from different countries, UK, Australia, European countries, typically surveys, the outcomes of surveys on barriers on physical activity and exercise is the number one reason is lack of time. The number two reason usually is low priority assigned to exercise, but I think this is low priority goes hand to hand with lack of time and low motivation. So they're all sides of the same coin, really.
Yeah, and you said high intensity incidental activity and an example of stair climbing. What other examples you have of high intensity ones?
The simplest HIIPA example would be to step up the pace, increase the pace of walking. There have been a number of epidemiological studies over the last few years, including our study, the study of 9 or 10 pooled British cohorts, which found that there is a very consistent association between walking pace and inverse association between walking pace and all-cause and cardiovascular mortality. In other words, the higher the walking pace, the lower the risk for cardiovascular mortality. And in our study, which was published in June 2018 in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, we found that such a finding was very, very pronounced among people aged 60 and older. So increasing the walking pace to the point that it becomes vigorous, and we know from Catherine Tudor-Locke's work that a heuristic threshold of 130 steps per minute is the absolute intensity, vigorous intensity for most adults. It is the simplest way to practice HIIPA, high intensity incidental physical activity. Other examples, simple things like parking the car at the edge of the car park, not outside the front of the supermarket, parking the car 100 meters away and carrying the shopping instead of using the trolley. Carrying shopping equivalent, I don't know, perhaps 10% of one's body weight, 10 kilograms or 7-8 kilograms for a 70-year-old person. That's another excellent example of high intensity physical activity. For most adults, we have the first realization we need to make when we think about HIIPA and exercise snacks and NEAT and all these things. The first realization is that people will reach high intensity because of the baseline fitness level in the population. It's so low, and we have seen it's getting lower. There have been a number of studies showing that the average fitness among adults is getting lower and lower and lower every decade, on a decade by decade basis. Because people are so unfit, even short bursts of high intensity physical activity will help them improve the baseline fitness, which in turn, hopefully, and I'm saying hopefully because this is not empirically tested yet, because this is a very new field of research, hopefully by building a little bit of fitness capacity, it will become easier for them to be able to consider and perhaps start an exercise program as well. But even in the absence of the exercise program, I believe that high-intensity incidental physical activity, these short, sporadic bouts of incidental activity embedded within day-to-day living, they do have considerable, very good potential to improve people's fitness, especially those middle-aged and older adults who are at the bottom of the cardiorespiratory fitness distribution.
Yeah. So basically, you said that just walking faster or carrying something heavy are the good options to get it higher intensity. And how do you see that? There's of course showing that any activity is good. Breaking up sitting just for a minute is good, but for higher intensity, do you think the heart rate needs to go up before it is beneficial in some aspects of it?
Yeah, we have as I mentioned before, we have a program of work planned around incidental physical activity. So I will reveal a couple of details about some of those studies. And one of those studies is essentially to physiologically define the bout of HIIPA, to physiologically define the bout of high intensity incidental physical activity. Now, based on the existing evidence, which comes from those proof of concept trials from McMaster University, we can see that even a 20-second vigorous climb of a staircase, 3 flights of stairs, which approximately takes if you do it fast, takes about 20-30 seconds. That leads to increases in heart rate in the region of over 80%, over 80-85%. And that will be the case. And these are experiments, these are studies, these are proof of concept trials that essentially recruited young adults. Now put in the same position a middle-aged person, an overweight or obese person, an unfit person, and definitely they will reach, during climbing three flights of stairs, they will reach very high intensity, in the region of over 80 to perhaps 90% of VO2 max or maximal theoretical age-specific maximal heart rate.
Let's hear a few words from our sponsors and continue right after that.
This podcast is sponsored by Fibion, a research device that has been shown to be valid in tracking sitting, standing, physical activity and energy expenditure. Furthermore, Fibion has been shown to be valid categorizing physical activity into light, moderate and vigorous intensity. In addition to scientific accuracy, Fibion provides automatically produced and easy-to-understand reports for research participants. Get scientific validation and learn more about Fibion at fibion.com/research.
Yeah, and have you thought of the aspects of muscle activity versus heart rate? Usually carrying something heavy is more kind of loading for the muscles rather than the heart. Have you thought of this?
Yeah, because it's such a new area and there are so many unknowns and there are so many things that need to be empirically defined. We start with cardiorespiratory fitness as the main outcome. We have to start from somewhere, obviously. We don't have unlimited resources, and when we put in grant applications, many funders prefer the application to be focused on specific outcomes, whether these are physiological outcomes, behavioral outcomes, or disease-related outcomes. So we start from fitness as cardiorespiratory fitness as the first outcome, but I totally agree that there are other aspects of fitness like musculoskeletal health and muscle strength that could also be tackled by higher intensity incidental physical activity. And I should perhaps make it clear that the target population here, the part of the population that is most likely to benefit are those who are at the bottom of the distribution, whether that's the muscle strength distribution in the population, whether that's the cardiorespiratory fitness distribution in the population, whether that's the balance, those who are at the bottom of the balance distribution, if such a thing exists. I don't think that they're balanced population-wise, wide balance standards, for example. But it's important to make this differentiation because what we, especially when we interact with media and journalists, what they ask, what journalists and many members of the general public are interested in is, so if I walk a bit faster, if I walk a few flights of stairs every day, is it okay to give up my gym? This is not about, high intensity incidental physical activity is not about building a very high level of fitness, and it's not the optimal. In a way, it's not the optimal. Of course, people who take part in a structured program of high intensity interval training, those who do CrossFit will experience faster results. Most pronounced results will experience better results. Their fitness across all levels, muscle strength, cardiorespiratory fitness, balance, everything will improve much, much better. So it is a concept about those that is most relevant to those middle-aged and older adults in particular, perhaps some young adults as well, who are very physically inactive, who are very unfit. But guess what? Thinking about middle-aged adults and older adults, this is the majority of the population. The majority of the population are very unfit. They have other cardiovascular risk factors. They suffer from diabetes. They're overweight or obese. They have high blood pressure. If you are to map the population in terms of these characteristics, fitness, how physically active they are, and whether they have some kind of diagnosed conditions, precursors typically of serious events like cardiovascular events or premature death. That's the large majority of the adult population. I can't add a figure to that, but I estimate it will be something around 80% and over of the adult population. So it's not a niche. It's not a niche issue. But at the same time, I think it's very important to be clear that it's not necessarily a panacea, and it's not necessarily the best way for people who are interested to maximize their fitness to become fit. Of course, we don't know. We don't know if we behaviorally establish that it is possible, and we do find the way to motivate, inform and motivate people to add many HIIPA bouts during the day. Who knows what we will see? If for example, someone does 15 or 20 bouts of 30, 60 seconds of high intensity physical activity every day, we really don't know. It could be that fitness could skyrocket. We do not know. There is no laboratory research or population level research to give us any clue about this. So we start from testing the concept and testing its physiological benefits, its physiological effects from the minimal dose, and this is what these are the studies, the series of studies we have planned, and we start from the minimal dose, approximately 3 to 4 HIIPA bouts per day. Because the proof of concept studies from McMaster University show that 3 sessions can have measurable effects. 3 sessions of stair climbing by 20 seconds each session, spread 1 to 4 days apart during the same day. Such a protocol of 3 sessions can have measurable effect on fitness over 6 weeks. So once we establish that what is the potential of a low dose, high intensity physical activity, then we will hopefully, by that time, we will have scaled up our research program, and we will be able to test the same concept in larger doses in different populations to see how far HIIPA can go.
I really like the concept and see the value, especially activating the bottom of the distribution, as you said. How do you see how this should be promoted? Have you done anything to promote the idea all the way to the population?
We have not done any empirical work to understand the behavioral translation of the concept and what are these messages that people will be able to act upon. This is part of the planned work we have. We have a fairly thorough program about it, but all I can tell you is the public response to media stories, an editorial we published back in February in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. So alongside the editorial we published, I wrote an article for The Conversation, that popular science website. The article was read 550,000 times within 5 days. And it generated a lot of comments. So there is a lot of interest, a lot of comments from readers, members of the public, who were saying that I love this idea. I would never exercise, but this is something that I'm going to try and incorporate into my day-to-day life because it sounds good. So there was very, very good response, very good response from the public, so I believe that if we get to a point and we do a bit more work to empirically find out what is the potential, physiological potential, long-term health potential, fitness promoting potential. And at the same time, we develop a little bit more the behavioral paradigm. How are we going to go about promoting it? I think the public will respond very, very well. At least these first signs are excellent, are fantastic. So we had good response. The piece had fairly good response by the scientific community. It got accessed a lot got lots of downloads in the British Journal of Sports Medicine website. I think something about 20,000 times, which is good for an editorial. It's fairly good. But the most encouraging sign from that press release, the editorial, the press release, and the publicity that followed was that the general public seemed to love the idea. Although I'm very, very careful every time I talk about it, I'm very, very careful because I don't want to sound as we're after the next quick fix. It's not about a quick fix. It's not a panacea. It's not. We're not claiming that the HIIPA should replace current physical activity guidelines, should replace the advice that clinicians and public health professionals give about the 150 minutes moderate and the 75 vigorous minutes of physical activity per week. It's in addition to, really. It's in addition to, and it's an alternative way for those who, for reason X, Y, or Z, will not engage in structure, in planned exercise, will never go to the gym, will never approach or do not have the capacity to have a personal trainer, will never go for a run, won't cycle to work, and so on.
Yeah, and you have been writing at least a couple of papers about the 2018 US Physical Activity Guidelines. Could you tell more about these papers of yours?
Yeah, I'm very interested on physical activity guidelines, physical activity and central behavior guidelines. It's how I see much of my work being translated, being communicated to the public. So I'm very passionate about those, and I'm involved in the forthcoming World Health Organization's Global Physical Activity Guidelines 2020, which will be released next year. It is very encouraging. Yeah, I believe that physical activity guidelines are evolving in the right way, are evolving in a very nice way. For example, and in particular, the the kind of the aspect of the American guidelines that, as I have written a few times, I'm most excited about is the removal of that 10-minute bout, the 10-minute bout for physical activity to be considered beneficial by guidelines. So that's a very positive development, opens several new avenues and opportunities. One of them is HIIPA, the high intensity incidental physical activity. But I believe that guidelines in the next few years, perhaps not in the next 5 years, I would say guidelines, the cycle of physical activity guidelines is 10 years for most organizations, like the Americans release them every 10 years, WHO update them every 10 years. The UK ones are a little less regular, but it was 2004-5, then 11, and then 2019, so 7, 8, 9 years. I think that in the next iterations of physical activity guidelines will be a turning point, and the reason is that we will start seeing objective physical activity studies with objective physical activity measurements occupying a larger and larger chunk of the evidence used to develop the future guidelines. Now, and why is this going to be a turning point? Because objective data will start telling us a different story. I believe that objective data will start telling us a different story as to what are the minimal and optimal amounts. And we saw that with the work of Ulf Ekelund, Inglis, BMJ paper that was published in August. We saw that very clearly, that when you pull a fair amount of accelerometry data and you harmonize it, you have a kind of a good and robust way to harmonize the studies and derive estimates in a consistent way. Effect sizes double compared to what questionnaire studies used to tell us, for MVPA at least. Now, let's not forget that this is very encouraging and very novel data, a fantastic study. I was fortunate to be a review for BMJ as well for the study. We should not forget that waist-worn accelerometry is relatively limited, although it is in some ways a step ahead compared to self-report. When we have eventually data from thigh-worn devices or data from studies that use more than one sensor, and there are such studies already, there are large epidemiological studies that implement multiple sensors, I think we will see even more new insights. We will have a lot richer, a lot more detailed information about how various aspects, including intensity, which is one of many dimensions of physical activity. We have focused so much on intensity or sedentary, light, moderate, and vigorous, only because this is what has been possible to measure. But when we have information, device-based data from other dimensions of physical activity, like the posture, like type, thigh-worn devices now, they can estimate fairly accurately type of physical activity, cycling versus stair climbing, walking, running. I believe that the guidelines will be forced to change, which is not going to be easy. And I'm not, I should make it clear that I'm not an advocate of making changes every time there are a few new studies, there are new body of evidence. Guidelines in terms of the headlines, the quantitative guidelines, I think they're fine as they are, and they should be left alone for a little while. It is very positive that none of the organizations that are developing or have recently developed physical activity guidelines have attempted to make any major changes on the headline 150, 75 vigorous or 150 moderate, because and it's very good that we stick to what the majority of evidence, the main body of evidence tells us, which comes from questionnaire-based studies. This 150 minutes and 75 comes from questionnaire-based studies. And we know it's not the absolute minimum anyway. So if someone wanted to change them, if they had the intentions to change them, they would have quite a few good arguments to change them, because we see more and more clearly that even when it comes to questionnaire data, the minimal threshold for rapid reductions in mortality and cardiovascular disease risk, for example, is well below the 150 minutes. However, I believe it's very positive that people stick to the main guidelines and they don't rush to change them. And the reason is that let's wait for a fair amount, a sizable body of objective physical activity studies to accrue, and then we discuss about changes. But even then, let's do it very, very carefully. Let's do it very, very carefully and be totally confident that these objective studies, future studies, will tell us a story that's different enough to make it worthwhile going into the trouble to changing them, and then having to kind of disseminate a new set of guidelines to the public, disseminate a new guideline to health professionals, and perhaps confuse some. So we don't want to be rushing and be making major changes every few years only because there are a few studies here and there. But in the 10 years from now, again, thinking about the future and judging from the current evidence production trajectory, in 10 years from now, we will have a lot of evidence from long-term, longitudinal studies with objective measurements of physical activity that perhaps will be going beyond the waist-worn devices with all their limitations that I mentioned earlier.
Let's hear a few words from our sponsors and continue right after that.
This podcast is sponsored by Fibion, a research device that has been shown to be valid in tracking sitting, standing, physical activity and energy expenditure. Get scientific validation and learn more about Fibion at fibion.com/research.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It definitely makes a difference whether you can actually measure different postures and different activity types. How do you see the recommendations? Isn't it quite tricky because anyway there's a dose response? So more you do activity, more benefits you get. So how do you define that? What do you say to the public that what is the recommendation?
Another major advancement, I would say, in how the guidelines, referring to the American guidelines in particular, are phrased is this idea of the band of volume, of amount. So it's not only about one value, it's about between 150 and 300 minutes of moderate intensity activity, for example. That's very positive because it is aspirational in the sense that we know that the majority of people won't meet the upper threshold, but for those who meet the lower threshold, offer some aspiration to try and do a bit more. And we have very good evidence that up to that level, the more the better. Clearly, the more the better. Although the law of diminishing returns applies on the dose response curve of physical activity, and we know that the largest benefits occur when we compare the completely inactive with those that do roughly half the recommended amount, 75 minutes, 80 minutes of 90 minutes of moderate, or about 40 minutes of vigorous. So again, how the guidelines are communicated is that all movement counts. The more, the better. And I would not worry too much. Again, this is a comment that sometimes you hear, and a question you get from media, from journalists, is what would you say to people who are on the borderline of exercise addiction? Yeah, there are extremes. There are some people who will interpret any health message the wrong way, and there's nothing we can do about it. But let's face it, exercise addiction is not the problem, the main problem. The main problem is physical activity and the fact that we have engineered out physical activity from daily living. We have created an environment that does not permit people, does not empower people, does not enable people to be physically active in their daily living.
Mm. Yeah, and in one of your paper you say about the physical activity guidelines and then implications for clinicians and the public. How do you see the difference between communicating to the different like clinicians and public the guidelines?
The first difference when we communicate guidelines and any health-related messages really between clinicians and the public is that with clinicians we have the opportunity to be a bit more sophisticated and a bit more detailed. With the public we have to go the simplest possible way. So phrasing, it's important, and how the advice and the guidelines are worded and communicated are important. But when we communicate into the public, we should be removing any idea of ambiguity and ambivalence. And what I'm trying to say is that remove any uncertainty that comes from the evidence, because the public gets confused once if you say, yes, this is the recommended type and amount, but anything that follows after that but is going to be a source of confusion. And if the public gets confused, they simply will disregard, they won't listen, and it will be fairly impossible to act upon any kind of advice, simply because people are over bombarded by all sorts of information these days. So simplicity is the number one priority, simplicity and consistency when it comes to communication to the public. The kind of consistency that comes with kind of sticking to the same guideline, not changing the main messages every few years. When we communicate guidelines to health professionals, I think we have the opportunity to be a bit more sophisticated, because they're obviously, thanks to their profession and their training, their professional training, they're more literate, more health literate. They can understand that concept of uncertainty. They can understand that different patient groups and different population groups perhaps have different needs. So the communication is slightly different, although consistency, it is important. It is important with clinicians as well. But we can go a bit further than the one-size-fits-all message with clinicians.
Yeah. And how do you think the next guidelines that are coming up, do you think there will be specifically mentioned the high intensity incidental physical activity opportunities, or how to do it?
Assuming that, for example, the next American guidelines will be published in 2028, the next WHO guidelines in 2030, perhaps. I really hope that by that point in time, we will have enough evidence to start fleshing out a message around high-intensity incidental physical activity. Now, whether we will be able to do it or not, we will do our best, obviously. I'm very interested in this, and I'm investing already a fair amount of time and energy and writing things. I'm writing grant applications. I think eventually it's down to the research community, to what extent they will believe in that concept to invest researching it. It's down to funders, which is an extension of the research community, to fund this kind of research. And these are the two main factors that will determine whether we will see specific elements about exercise snacks or high intensity incidental physical activity, or whatever term is eventually going to survive to describe this concept, the concept of HIIPA we coined this year. Other elements of the future physical activity and central behavioral guidelines. We we have made a case in a paper published last year about sedentary behavior, about sitting guidelines, that the timing is not right. I think that in 10 years from now, perhaps we will be in a position to have quantitative guidelines about sitting as well. I cannot really predict because I can see that there is a fairly hot debate. There was some debate even before what we published. I think our piece, the 2018 piece, kind of heated the debate a bit more as to whether sedentary behavior is simply the inverse of physical activity. And in a way, yeah, I think the sedentary behavior as a field has done immense good to our research paradigm. It was very, very good that the discussion about this very low intensity activity and sedentary behavior about 15, 20 years ago when this discussion started. And what it prompted us to do is to move away from the MVPA, moderate to vigorous physical activity paradigm, which in a way it's quite narrow. Now, whether sedentary behavior will survive as a distinct, as a behavioral risk factor in its own right, this is something I cannot predict, because there is a fairly hot debate as to whether it's a standalone or it's simply the inverse of light intensity physical activity. So one might argue, instead of advising people to sit less, why don't you advise people to move at any opportunity, to move more, to move at any intensity?
Yeah, that's
it will be interesting. Yeah, it will be very interesting. Yeah, it will be very, very interesting to see how things will evolve in the next few years.
I could see that it's always so many processes in the body, biochemical. There's different pressure when you sit. There's different position on your back. That it's not only the other side of sedentary behavior and physical activity. Of course, many of the effects might be, but don't you think that there's so many things? I think we are not designed to sit as evolutionary animals, that it's probably not, we are not designed to sit, and probably it's not a good idea to sit too much.
Yeah, we're not designed to sit in the to the extent that we sit, and at least we should make it clear that we refer to that part of the population who have occupations, mostly who have occupations that force them to sit in a way. There are other occupations. There are still active occupations who have to be moving for much of the day at a light intensity. For example, cleaners, supermarket workers, sales assistants. So we should be sitting as a posture is very complex. I totally agree, and I do acknowledge. And as I said earlier, I think it's a paradigm that did a lot of good. It was very positive that all this discussion that the sedentary behavior as a research area was introduced about 15 years ago. That was very, very. There's no doubt about that. It's a very sitting as a posture is very complex. Definitely something. It's a big part of the problem. There is no doubt about that, because when someone sits, there is no movement. So when someone sits, there is no movement. Now, when it comes to adults, working age adults at least, we do need to integrate a bit the occupational health paradigm with leisure time physical activity paradigm. And we need to acknowledge that for certain occupations, sitting is not a bad thing, because they need to recover. And their problem is they don't have adequate time to recover from this constant light intensity physical activity, or in some occasions light to moderate intensity physical activity. So it is something that is context specific. The importance of sitting in office workers who are forced to be sitting for many hours. It's something to be treated in a different way to those workers who, as a matter of what their occupation entails, the tasks they have to do during the work, and have no or very little opportunity to sit and recover. But considering the totality of the population, I think sitting is a potential target. It is a potential target, but I think how you tackle it, whether you tackle it through messages around doing more physical activity of any intensity, or specifically discouraging people to sit, I think we don't have the answer yet. What's the better approach? What's the best approach? There has been a number of interventions. So one of the things that kind of gave momentum to this area of sedentary behavior 10, 15 years ago, it was the argument that somehow it will be a lot easier for people to not to be sitting than doing exercise. Okay, so that argument has some face value. It is a lot easier to simply stand, there is no doubt about that, than joining a gym, getting ready to go to the gym, going to the gym, doing whatever your program, then changing, having a shower, coming back. Yeah, behaviorally it's a lot less complicated. But if you see at empirical evidence, if you look at studies, if you look at meta-analysis and systematic reviews of studies that target sedentary behavior or physical activity, it doesn't seem to be behaviorally. They don't seem to be more successful. Sedentary behavior reducing trials do not seem to be more successful than exercise or physical activity increasing trials. So they're both difficult. Changing people's habit is difficult. So that's the bottom line. That's the bottom line. And we still have not discovered, we still do not know what is the best behavioral approach to change people's behavior towards a healthier physical activity and sitting pattern.
And how do you see that anyway? Like you told that just standing up it's easier than going to the gym, but then the interventions are not more effective. Do you think it's because sitting is defined by norms quite widely, or why do you think it is like this?
I think it's the power of habit and the power of the environment. I think that's why these are the reasons why sitting reducing interventions are not more successful than physical activity interventions. And typically, you see that sitting reducing interventions, they are successful in reducing sitting by 20, 25, 30 minutes per day, which is not always replaced by physical activity. Some of that is standing. In the occupational domain, of course, they're more successful in the sense that you see much larger effect sizes when you have sit-stand intervention. So when sitting is replaced by standing through the use of a sit-stand desk, you see effect sizes in the region of 1 to 2 hours per day. I think the problem and the power of the habit. The power of the habit. So people are accustomed to doing things in their everyday life in a certain way, and it is not easy for people to change that habit, especially when the environment does not encourage them, and when the environment does not enable them to change behavior in the long term.
Yeah.
Us researchers in the field of in any health-related field tend to think that because we think about health and because we think about physical activity and healthy lifestyles, much of our time, both as professionals and as individuals, the majority of us are physically active people, we think that the public thinks the same. I think that health and health behaviors is a much lower priority for the general public. And when it becomes a priority, it's a priority in the sense how to find a quick fix, how to find the healthy alternative, the healthy behavior without making much effort. And this is something that I'm very clear and honest with myself and my colleagues about. That this is the kind of problem we will encounter when we try to promote high-intensity incidental physical activity as well.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, like we've been talking about the next physical activity guidelines. What is your prediction? How will be the guidelines in 2050?
2050. By that time, we will have a lot of evidence from 5 devices and devices, perhaps studies that use multiple sensors. So epidemiological studies by that time will be able to estimate very accurately, very objectively and very accurately people's type of physical activity, the posture, perhaps the domain as well, which is devices currently are very poor in measuring, understanding different domains. But I expect that by that, in 30 years' time, we will have cracked that as well. We will be able to use devices to understand whether people do transportation activity, related activity, occupational activity, or recreational activity. So I think it will be a body of evidence that will mostly based on, primarily will be based on devices. Of course, it will not be only devices. We will still have studies, these long-term cohorts that have always used questionnaires. It's very hard to say. It's very hard to say how the guidelines will change, because if I could predict what the evidence will be like in 10 or 15 years, I think that would make me a little biased towards trying to find these elements of the evidence, these changes. But I think we will have specific guidance on central behavior. We will have specific guidance on the balance of postures that will be specific to the occupational context, to the occupational circumstances, people's circumstances. And we will see, like many other aspects of medicine, we will see a movement towards personalization, what we call precision medicine, which I am skeptical. I have always been skeptical for both of those entities, which appeared. Sometimes they are used interchangeably, precision medicine and personalized medicine, because there has been a huge investment since 2000. And I remember 2000, there were pieces in Science and Nature saying that we're 10 years away from the personalized medicine, from the time when a patient would go to their doctor and the doctor would give them a lifestyle prescription and medication prescription that entirely matches their very personal genotypic and phenotypic profiles. As we know, this is still a future scenario, so 20 years down the line, almost 20 years down the line, and we still have not seen any tangible results. So personalized medicine and precision medicine at the disease burden reduction, at the disease prevention level, I do not think has produced any tangible results at all, despite the huge investment, the huge financial investment by taxpayers' money, the huge financial investment by the private sector in industry. So whether physical activity will go down that path, I think it is likely. It is likely because there are so many financial interests linked to precision and personalized medicine. I think this is a kind of concept we'll be hearing a lot about in the next few years, also, like we've been hearing the last 20 years. Whether it works or not, because there are large financial interests involved. There is a large investment in genotyping, for example, people, and trying to prescribe specific therapies and specific lifestyle changes.
Let's hear a few words from our sponsors and continue right after that.
This podcast is sponsored by Fibion. Get scientific validation and learn more about Fibion at fibion.com/research.
So do you Yeah, do you think there's much to be personalized? Like probably everyone needs some aerobic exercise or movement, some muscle strengthening is beneficial. Do you think there's much to actually personalize, or how do you see it?
Uh, I don't think that personalization is the way forward, because personalization is extremely costly at any level. To kind of to genotype and phenotype one person and then prescribe a program that is very specific to them, it's very costly. And even if someone is prescribed perfectly, even if one day it becomes possible to be prescribed the perfect, the most tailored program for one's genotype and needs and circumstances, we know that the problem is not the prescription, the limiting factor is not the prescription. The limiting factor is people's motivation and people's supporting environment. So people who could be prescribed whatever program, if they go back to the environment that prevented them in the first place to be physically active, they will be physically inactive again. And it's exactly the same story like with healthy eating habits. You can go to a dietitian and be prescribed whatever. The perfect diet, the dietitian can do all sorts of assessments. They can refer you to a medical center to do blood tests to see what nutritional deficiencies one suffers from, and then they can prescribe them the perfect diet. Then if the person goes back to an environment that is hostile to healthy eating and there is no healthy foods are available, they will go back to the same eating patterns. It's exactly the same for physical activity. So I don't think that personalization, I think we will be hearing a lot about it. It is a scientific fad in a way. It's a long-lasting scientific fad, and we'll be hearing a lot about it. I do not think that it's the way forward for producing population-wide positive change at the population level. We should not forget that the unhealthiest layers of the society are those who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, the people with the lowest capacity for behavioral change, not only because they don't always have the information, or they have more difficult access to up-to-date information, but the lowest levels of the society, the most socioeconomically advantaged, are the people who would assign the least priority to lifestyle change. These people have a lot more serious problems to deal on a day-to-day basis, whether they have enough to make ends meet, to buy food for their children, pay for their bills, or all these kind of consequences and societal problems that are very prevalent and present among disadvantaged groups, like alcoholism, crime, domestic violence. So all these such circumstances are not a fertile ground for people to worry about cutting the 10-year cardiovascular disease risk by increasing their physical activity by 20 minutes per day.
Yeah, I see that. And when you made the prediction for 2050, you were saying that then it will be more thigh-worn data and maybe some domain information, whether the person was in transportation, and information of posture. What would be the ideal device to measure physical activity and sedentary behavior? Like, what would you like to see in a device?
Mm-hmm. It's a device that will be collecting physiological data at the same time as measuring posture, intensity. So at this point in time, we have different devices, usually different placements, wrist-worn, waist-worn, thigh-worn, and each device collects quite different types of information. In all devices, what is the current reality is that all these devices are basically triaxial accelerometers. The consumer wearable devices sector is a little bit more brave, and it's a bit more brave because they need to be selling products continuously, and they need to be bringing new innovation all the time so that consumers replace their existing gadget with the next one. The research grade industry is a bit more cautious, and I'm very glad that it's a bit more cautious because we do need the same devices to stay in the market for a number of years so that we have the capacity and the opportunity to validate them, to compare them with each other. The perfect device for 2040 or 2050 will be a device that will be more than one device, so that is good for understanding posture, because we know that there is no single placement with this current technology, the triaxial accelerometer technology. There is not a single placement that is perfect. Even the thigh placement that we have invested on as part of the prospective physical activity sitting and sleep consortium, we know that it doesn't do a fantastic job for differentiating between reclining and sitting. Although there are algorithms to do it fairly okay, it's not perfect. And that's a very interesting question. It's a very interesting question what degree of accuracy is necessary for any device, is necessary for us to capture and understand better physiological effects of physical activity and long-term risks of physical inactivity and sitting. I do have this discussion with my colleagues quite often, and the discussion goes as follows. So you typically, people who are doing a lot of work on accelerometry, developing algorithms, machine learning to develop algorithms for detection of activity pattern, type of physical activity, and people who are into who do research into they have a very strong focus on accuracy of the devices. Now, my argument is, wait a sec. So we have all this body of evidence coming from questionnaires. The large majority of evidence is still questionnaire based. Now, if we were to put a figure on percentage on how accurate questionnaires are, what accurate picture questionnaires give us, how accurate is the picture of people's daily physical activity at the population level, this is a guess. It's not an empirically derived figure in any way, but I estimate that questionnaires are approximately 20, 25, call it 30, stretch to 30% accurate, because they miss out all these very large chunks of activity, and they miss out information about short bouts, lack of interest activity. They cannot measure incidental physical activity. So at best, questionnaires go 25, 30. Now, compare that with waist-worn device, for example. We'll go a bit higher. I think we'll go around 50%, perhaps. Of course, there are some aspects of physical activity that questionnaires can measure and waist-worn devices cannot measure, but let's assume that waist-worn devices go a bit further, and they are 50% accurate. Then we have combined studies that use combined sensors, that they use thigh-worn, let's say, and lower back. So you get fairly good accuracy in terms of posture, very good accuracy if you do either you do rules-based or machine learning-based physical activity type recognition. You start getting a lot of information that until now only questionnaires give you. So let's say that two sensors will give you 70, 80% accuracy. Does it really matter over that 50, 60, 70? Does it really matter? Is it going to make any difference if we get the perfectly accurate device that gives us information about each and every aspect of physical activity as well as physiological responses? I'm not sure. For epidemiological studies, for large-scale population studies, we may see that the law of diminishing returns applies to the accuracy of the measurement as well. So the bottom line is that we should try and make best use of available data. It is very positive that there is a strong, good movement for improving the measurement of physical activity, so we can we should continue doing so. But I think that we shouldn't get too obsessed about it to reach and develop the perfect device. I hope that at some point in the future, this research-grade device will be able to incorporate at least one aspect of will be capturing some form of physiological information as well, heart rate, for example.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point. How important the accuracy is in the end? Is it diminished, returned? Do you think then that it should be more integrating different sensors, trying to measure different physiological responses, even though they are not maybe that accurate?
I think the future belongs to a single sensor setup. And the reason is that in large epidemiological studies, the more sophisticated, the more complex the sensors set up, the lower the adherence. So you will be solving one problem, you'll be collecting better quality of data, and you'll be creating another problem, which will be that people will be refusing to wear the devices, creating some kind of selection bias. Or people will be taken off the device because it's too burdensome. There is a bright exception to what I'm saying that perhaps make me sound that I'm wrong already, and that's a study from Norway, the HIIPA cohort. So the HIIPA, they've done an amazing job with implementing a dual sensor setup, thigh worn and lower back worn, two perfectly synchronized sensors. And they did, in terms of adherence, I can't remember the percentage, they did it really, really well. So they measured 40,000 people, the majority of them, I think 36,000 are adults, 4,000 adolescents. And in terms of response rates, excellent. They were very, very good. And people, pretty much the large majority of the sample who were given the devices, who were on the two devices, had usable data. Now, HIIPA, it's a regional cohort. We should not forget that. It's a regional cohort with very strong rapport and support by the local population. In other words, it's a region in Norway where the residents feel that this is our cohort, we need to support it, we need to protect it. So I don't think that that's necessarily, this kind of circumstances is necessarily transferable and to other national cohorts in Australia, in the UK. I think for the majority of the